Okay, we're doing it. This is it. It being week 4 of exposure. An exposure in the context of OCD therapy, of course, is willingly confronting the feared stimuli. If you have contamination OCD, germs, that sort of thing. For me, what I am trying to expose with these videos is my perfectionism. So this is a completely unplanned and hence very imperfect video. Okay. And this week I am coming to you from New York City, from Manhattan, and I have to say I do not love New York. New York has been or was my home for pretty much my entire adult life after college, decades. And yeah, the romance is over, though also, there's no such thing as unconditional love, of course, with humans or with places. And I think my love for New York was always somewhat conditional on seasons and weather, and the weather here has been unremittingly grim, gray, rainy, floods, biblical floods, canceling some of my comedy shows, so that hasn't helped. But I think even if it weren't for that, I don't know, I kind of feel like an anthropologist visiting some primitive tribe here, and I'm like, how do they live like this? I mean, I was one of them for so many years. I mean, and recently too. It's not like I've, completely severed ties with New York, but since the pandemic, I've spent less than half of my time in New York. And more, my heart belongs to San Francisco. Not the city as a city, New York, there's no competition. I do not love San Francisco as a city, but what I love about the San Francisco Bay Area is the Bay Area, the mountains and ocean surrounding it. What I don't love about New York is the fact that there is no equivalent here. The lack of nature feels heavy to me here. And what it does, I'm seeing it very clearly, among other things, is it really puts me in my head. This is a very head city, because one of the reasons I love nature so much and can get obsessed with nature to a sometimes unhealthy degree, obsessing about the perfect hikes, is because nature, when I'm in nature, some of my energy is withdrawn from my head, from my thinking, and it sinks down into more of a presence in my body, and this happens more or less effortlessly. And I would say proportionate to how awe-inspiring the nature is. I am a nature snob, which is why when people are like, oh, you get nature in New York, Central Park, I'm like, no, I want fucking thundering surf, towering mountains, serrated ridges, and the Bay Area has all of that. And, of course, my heart belongs to the Bay Area in another way, too. That is where my partner, Anna, lives. Though I will say, a few days, so I've been in New York now for a week. I actually leave tomorrow. We'll get to that. My plans kind of got thrown. But as I shared last week, a few days before I was leaving the Bay Area, I found myself besieged with intense doubts. Not about Anna. I mean, not even about the relationship, I guess they were, but it was this... I did talk about this last week. But yeah, this sort of sense of, I don't really know about this. Something about it's like, not even it doesn't feel right, because it doesn't feel right as such an OCD thing. OCD, the seduction OCD offers is if you get it right, you'll feel good. Whether it's contamination fear, you're perfectly clean, or in my case, with decision-making OCD, you've made the right decision. If you get it right, you feel good. So when you make a decision and it doesn't feel right, well, you don't feel good, well then it's not the right decision, and make and reverse decisions. This was my life for so many years. The overt OCD is much, much better, but perfectionism, what my friend Jordan calls this OCD adjacent trait, is still constricting. Hence this very imperfect video. Where was I though? My point being, and this perfectionism kept me alone for so long, because when I'd meet women, they were never quite right. Or sometimes they were. Sometimes they checked all the boxes, but invariably those women weren't interested in me, which just reinforced my sense that, they are the perfect person, and somehow I messed it up, and how can I fix it? But, as I've shared, I had this mushroom trip a year and a half ago where I saw the reason I hadn't found the deep love I'd wanted, and once had 20 years ago, the reason I hadn't found that again is because I didn't really want it. Or, more accurately, I did want it. I wanted deep connection, but I didn't want the vulnerability. I wanted two mutually exclusive things. It was an oxymoron. And so the tension between these two competing desires had served to keep me alone. And the mechanism by which this had played out was primarily wibbly. which I've shared before. Wibly is an acronym I've invented, WWIBLI. What would it be like if? Comparing a situation I'm in, or in this case, a woman I'm with some alternate reality. What would it be like if we had better conversation? What would it be like if I found her more physically attractive? What would it be like if we shared more of a sense of humor? That's what kept me alone. And with Anna, there's been none of that. No comparison. No desire for anyone else, now coming up on a year and a half. But this fear that emerged right before I left the Bay Area was this sort of very vague, broad. It was just kind of like, I don't know, this doesn't quite feel right. And Anna and I worked through this, and I left the Bay Area feeling closer to her than I ever have, which is the pattern generally. When there's some sort of conflict or some sort of challenge in the relationship, we talk about it. It brings us closer together. And so maybe that's part of why I don't love New York now, is I want to be back in the Bay Area with her. And the lack of nature is tough here. And the fact that there is a kid screaming, shrieking. I'm staying. I have a friend, a very generous friend, who has a massive penthouse in the West Village. And he lets me stay here for free when he's not here, and he usually isn't here. And it's generally very quiet because it's almost the entire floor of this building, but there are 2 other units, and somehow this kid is screaming so loudly. All right, good. This is an exposure. The more distraction, the more this sucks, the better it is, basically. Because the deal is, I've got to put this out no matter what. So, thank you, unnamed brat, for intensifying my perfectionism exposure. Okay. Yeah, being in New York now, there's a feeling of, God, why was I here so long? 25 years I lived here. And it never fully felt like home, but I think a big part of why I lived here for 25 years was this heartbreak. 20 years ago, this significant relationship that ended, because New York, to me, it is a city that promises, even if it doesn't deliver, romance. There's something very romantic about this city. There's a lot of beautiful people here. A lot of people talk about how beautiful the women are in LA. I don't know. I mean, for me, there's no comparison to New York. And also, of course, there's this sense of possibility, because it's not like you're driving past beautiful women on the freeway in your car like in LA. No, you're seeing them on the street all the time. And not just beautiful, interesting, creative. That possibility that anything can happen. I have a good friend who met his wife on the subway. There's just this possibility that it comes when you compress so many people in such a small area. But I think that's also part of why I don't love New York now. There is something energetically, and I mean that literally, not metaphorically. When you get so many people in such a small area, we are energetic beings. And I'm not talking about chakras and astral planes. I mean, the human body is an electrical system. We consume energy, we put out energy, electrical fields, and I do believe something about having so many of these electrical fields in such a small geographic space. There is an unmistakable, indescribable but unmistakable energy. Well, let me attempt to describe it. To me, it's a very driving energy. There is something thrilling about it, and I think that's part of what kept me here. But it also is driving in the sense of I don't know, once I took this obscure psychedelic, this was a long time ago, called AMT. It was actually an antidepressant in Russia, but a powerful psychedelic, and I think it was like 12 hours, and it's one of these sort of psychedelic amphetamines. And I remember at a certain point, the psychedelic effects had ended, but it just felt like this thing was driving my body. It was just driving my thoughts. And that's what New York is like. New York is a distinct drug to me. A distinct drug to me. And a fun drug, but an exhausting drug. And I think, maybe like stimulants, it kind of messes with your idea of the passage of time. When I hear myself say I spent 25 years here, I'm like, that just seems unbelievable. Because the city always hurt me. The lack of nature was a palpable pain for me here. But that possibility of romance, that possibility of finding the thing that I most longed for, finding that deep love again, I think that's what kept me here. And the excitement, and the friends, and then once I became a performer, The comedy scene here is second to none. Yeah, there's a lot I did love about New York, but no longer. And I don't know, maybe my brain is intentionally like shutting out the possibility of New York so that I don't get caught up in this eternal question of, New York versus somewhere else. This kid, you probably can't hear him, but I'm actually impressed with his lung capacity as a performer who does 90-minute monologues and often finds that, it can be challenging maintaining breath support. This kid is a natural. All right. So, yeah, because my mind likes binary things. So maybe a part of it is my mind is like saying like, no, New York sucks. You don't have to think anymore about maybe whether you should be spending time in New York. But, and I'm going to be spending less time in New York. So I was supposed to be here for a month. And I was coming here primarily to do 2 shows. One happened a couple of nights ago. I performed with Melissa Etheridge. Not showcasing my vocal chops, but Melissa has a foundation called, fittingly enough, the Etheridge Foundation, dedicated to advocating psychedelics primarily for substance use disorder, but they're looking to expand the mandate. This comes out of a tragedy. Her son, Beckett, died of, I think it was a fentanyl. All right. I'm going to turn over the mic to this kid. I think you can hear him now. Now they're in the hallway. Anna and I have been talking about having kids, but yeah, this is no, because this kid. Oh God, really? Child tax credits? Why should you be given a tax break for creating that? There should be a penalty. But what are they doing in the hallway? They have presumably, I haven't seen their apartment, but presumably a similarly massive apartment. They're playing in the hallway? All right, let's try this again. So, Melissa Etheridge has a foundation called, appropriately enough, the Etheridge Foundation, which is dedicated to advocating for, basically, not just advocating, funding basic research into psychedelics with a focus on treating substance use disorders. Her son, Beckett, passed away a few years ago from, I believe, a fentanyl overdose. And it went phenomenally well. I was a little nervous just because it was a $600 plate dinner, and the organizer had sort of said, like, yeah, these are going to be hardcore Melissa Etheridge fans, not necessarily hardcore psychedelic people. But I crushed it. I'll dispense with false modesty. And this is how I know I crushed it, is I was competing against pizza. And this brought back past trauma for me, because when I was earlier in my comedy career, so comedy is extraordinarily competitive in New York. So shows, particularly shows that don't have, well-known comics that are featuring newer comics, they often have to come up with gimmicks to draw audience. And a common, not that common, but a gimmick here is what would often be called pizza shows. Basically, come to this comedy show and you get free pizza. And the worst spot on these shows was what we called the pizza spot, where you're on stage as people are being served pizza, because it is very hard to compete with cheesy goodness. And this show, this Etheridge benefit, just as I was getting on stage, the waiters were bringing out this very gourmet thin crust pizza, and people put down their pizza and listened. Captivated, really captivated. And I did something that I think only I do, where I wove together comedy, but also some very heartfelt stuff, some very self-revealing stuff, talked about OCD, talked about addiction, got people laughing, and I felt really good off stage. And then also I felt like my career is not where I want it to be. And in a sense, when I have a great show, and most of my shows go really well, that makes it more painful. Because sometimes I like to tell myself, oh, your career isn't that successful because you're not that good. That's less painful to believe that, well, I'm kind of getting what I deserve. But to believe that, oh no, I have a lot of potential and I'm not reaching the audiences I could reach because, well, this came to me, I shared about this before, I think, on an LSD trip. on my birthday about 6 months ago, where I realized the same way on this mushroom trip a year and a half ago, I realized the reason I don't have the love I really want is because I'm afraid of it. On this LSD trip, I realized the reason I don't have the career I really want is because I am similarly afraid of it. I'm afraid of being more visible. I'm afraid of having more people judge me. I'm afraid of having more people not like me and criticize me. Now, when that mushroom trip happened, I connected with Anna 4 days later. This LSD trip was several months ago, and my career has not appreciably shifted. And to be fair, it's not exactly the same. Most people can have a relationship. Most people cannot have a successful career as a performer, even if they want it. So I'm not saying that it's just this sort of fear that has limited my career. But I think that's a big part of it. And I think that's part of the perfectionism too. The perfectionism has been a mechanism, because if nothing's ever good enough, I don't put stuff out. Hence this imperfect video. So yeah, it was sweet having this great performance, but it was also a little bit like, yeah, man, I should be doing more high profile performances. So I did that one. And then the other show is in a few weeks. I'm going to do the Mushroom Cure in New York, because I'm focusing post this LSD trip. You know, I'd really put the Mushroom Cure on the back burner. I was working on this new thing, Adam Strauss is Not Unhappy, which is a show I really enjoy doing. It's coming along really well. But post this mushroom trip, I realized, and Anna helped me see this, yeah, if you genuinely want to accelerate your career, don't put your energy into building a new show. Take the show you already have, the Mushroom Cure, and try to bring that to a wider audience. So I'll be doing a show in mid-October. I'll be doing the Mushroom Cure, October 14th in New York, with the express purpose of getting industry people there. And this was all set. But then a few days after I got to my friend's place here, he told me that unexpectedly he has to come back. He's actually coming back tomorrow. I have to clear out. And this threw me into not quite OCD. I mean, certainly not OCD the way it would before. So let me be specific. So this then forced me to grapple with a number of decisions. I was planning on being here for a few weeks, and now it's like, okay, what am I going to do? I can go back to San Francisco for a couple of weeks and come back and do the Mushroom Cure. I could just say, screw the Mushroom Cure. Like, yeah, you know, I've done it a lot in New York. Maybe some good industry stuff will come out of the show in mid-October, but maybe it won't, and I can do it another time when I can more easily be housed in New York, because my friend generally is not here. Or I could go visit my family, my parents, who live in a 2-family house with my sister, brother-in-law, and my magical nephews and nieces, but I've spent a lot of time there. If this had been 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, this would have taken over these decisions, this constellation of decisions, these moving parts. I would have been buying and canceling plane tickets, completely enveloped in this decision, debilitated, non-functional. But I do have a lot of recovery. But my recovery is certainly, there's more recovery to do, and this is what gets tricky because, so it didn't take over, but if I'm going to be honest, and if I'm not going to be honest, what the fuck is the point of this? If I'm going to be honest, there was a lot of time and energy spent figuring out these decisions of what I'm doing for the next couple of weeks. A lot of time. How much time? I mean, it didn't dominate, but it was churning in the background. A lot of my brain's processing power is churning in the background. I'll be honest, I went to Orbitz checking different plane tickets over the course of the week. 30 times maybe. So yeah, it didn't dominate the way it used to, but there was certainly more time than would be ideal spent on this. And not just time, there is also an underlying anxiety. The more time I put into these decisions, the more important it feels to get it right, and that starts to create this anxiety. And this anxiety ultimately is what did fuel the full-blown OCD. Because the tricky thing about OCD, I've shared before, I view it as an addiction, a strategy to avoid pain that works in the short term, but then creates more pain, which drives more of the addictive strategy. And so when you already have some baseline anxiety, if you have OCD, that's essentially your drug of choice. You are going to reach for the metaphorical bottle of OCD because it does give relief some of the time, very transiently. When you feel like you've gotten it right with OCD, maybe you feel good for 30 seconds, a minute if you're lucky. And then it's like, oh, no, it doesn't feel right. And that just sends you right back into the OCD. So again, this didn't take over, but there was this, it weighed on me. weighed on me. Almost literally. I mean, this is something I appreciate more and more as, thanks to psychedelics, I'm more and more in touch with my body and less fully identified with my thinking. Is when I go into these, when I spend a lot of time kind of trying to figure something out, it wears on the body. There's a wariness. There's a, it feels like it's hard on my body and hard on my brain. And I also know I'm reinforcing neural pathways that I don't want to reinforce. This is the hard thing, is when the OCD was really bad, the incentive to get freedom was very high. And the payoff in getting more freedom was very high because I was absolutely miserable. But now it's like, it doesn't cause tremendous distress. And indeed, there is some payoff from it. Because when I do feel like I'm getting it right, it does feel good. And perhaps I'm more vulnerable to this because I've been trying to let go of a lot of my low-level addictions, which I've shared about, checking my phone a lot, checking weather a lot, this bizarre addiction where I check weather constantly, even weather in places I'm not, because I imagine it's a wibbly thing. What would it be like if I was in this place? Letting go of a lot of the sort of incessant, unnecessary thinking. As I shared, I hit the worst OCD I've had in months about 3 weeks ago. In the aftermath of that, I was able to let go of a lot of this incessant thinking. Unfortunately, though unsurprisingly, a lot of that has come back since I got back to New York. And this leads me to a point I made at the beginning of this video. New York is a very head city for me. Because of the lack of nature, which reliably puts me in my body more, I tend to be more in my head here. And because of that concentrated energy of these, millions of people, it just, And so I've found myself checking my phone more. I've found myself getting caught in unnecessary thoughts, judgments, wibbly thoughts, that sort of thing, that I'd gotten a lot of freedom from the last few weeks. So I don't love New York. I don't love New York. And I'm glad I don't love New York. It does clarify things. Not that it was unclear. That, the Bay Area is my home for now. Not least because that's where Anna is, and that's where the ocean and the mountains are. But this last week was humbling, just seeing how much time and energy went into these decisions. And I think of Anna, like one way we're very well matched is we're well matched opposites in a lot of domains. And one is I spend far too much time deliberating my moves, what action I'm going to take in the world. She arguably spends too little time. She's always talking about how she wants to close the tab. If something pops up, she wants to deal with it and then be done with it and not think about it. And the first time she used that phrase with me, I want to close the tab, I was like, oh yeah, it is kind of like that. And of course, I don't think it will surprise anyone who knows me. That is literally what my browser is like, 60 tabs open. She doesn't live like that. And yes, sometimes maybe she errs too far in that direction. She dispenses with an important matter too hastily and makes a decision that turns out not to be the best decision. But overall, I think that's a much better way to live because of the simple fact that we are all mortal. Time is limited. Better to be taking more action in the world, even if it's sometimes not the ideal action, than to be deliberating and strategizing and taking fewer actions. And of course, one thing I know is that even when I do obsess, it doesn't lead necessarily to better decisions. And this indeed is backed up by psychological research. There's a great study. This is from when I studied undergrad psych, so forgive me if I mess up the details, but it was something to the effect of when people are making a relatively unimportant decision, like choosing a carrot peeler, maybe it literally was a carrot peeler, I don't remember, but some sort of small item, doing a certain amount of research actually leads to a better decision, a decision they're happier with. But with a bigger decision, like buying a house, more research doesn't lead to decisions they're happier with. It's actually better to just kind of go with the gut pretty quickly. And the decisions I do reliably spend too much time thinking about are bigger decisions. So, the reality is whether you deliberate for hours or moments, you can't be certain you're making the right decision. And that's ultimately what my condition is about, is I am looking for something that doesn't exist. I am looking for certainty. And not certainty in the moment, certainty in the future. I want to know how things are going to play out. I'm looking for this impossible thing in a time that doesn't actually exist, the future. It's a mental construct. So, and yet I know all this. I know all this. And I knew all this week as I was checking orbits for the 27th time. You're not going to get it right, man. You're not going to get this feeling of reassurance. And yet, boom, still refreshing the browser. And I think this comes down to powerless. I've shared before that a big part of my recovery has been a 12-step program called Obsessive Compulsive Anonymous, essentially like Alcoholics Anonymous, but for OCD, because OCD is an addiction, I believe. And the first step is realizing you're powerless over the obsessions and compulsions. And when I really got that step, this was 2010, I believe, or 2009, it was in some ways the most profound experience of my life. It was a moment of, in some ways, fear, because I knew I couldn't control this thing. I saw how implacable the OCD is. Implacable. But also liberation. Well, if you can't control it, you can just let go. And it was a spiritual experience. It was a moment where for the first time I felt like I was able to rely on some sort of higher power and really pray from the heart. But I forget it. I forget that I'm powerless. I keep acting like, oh, I can control this thing. I can get it right. I can figure it out. So I'm sitting there checking orbits knowing, dude, you can't get it right. Telling myself you're powerless. You've gone down this rabbit hole. And let me be clear, powerless doesn't mean you have to give in to the OCD, but it means once you've gotten to a certain point, it's like an alcoholic. I believe an alcoholic has the choice whether or not to take that first drink, maybe even that second drink, but at a certain point you start to lose control. And once I'm checking orbits for the 27th time, I am not in control. I do still have free will. I can still choose to close the browser, step away from the computer, or better yet, buy a non-refundable ticket. Close the tab, literally and metaphorically. I do have that choice. But I am powerless over the compulsion to keep trying to get it right, to keep trying to get this reassurance, this certainty, this safety. But, I did close the tab eventually. And again, if this had been years ago, it would be tomorrow morning and I'd probably have a ticket purchased but refundable and be like obsessing right before I have to leave for the airport. Should I cancel? Should I? And so there is growth there. It didn't take over the same way. I did close the tab. So I'm leaving New York. I'm going to go to my parents' place for 12 days, which feels like a lot, even though I love them and I want to see them. And I treasure the time with my father, who has Alzheimer's, even though it's also painful. But, he's not that far along. We can certainly engage, though not the same way. And my nephews and nieces are magical. And we're going to go to the Cape for a few days, which is great. And then I'll come back and I'll do the mushroom cure. And then I'll go back to the Bay Area and on. And I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to just kind of settling in. I haven't slept in the same bed for 2 weeks since June, I think. So, yeah. I'm looking forward to settling in. So, that is week 4. Starring me and these fucking brats. Okay. Yeah. I am now going to go and do stand-up. And, I don't know. I'm feeling a desire to, wrap this up. But I don't have to wrap this up. This is my exposure. And there are no neat endings. Life is not neat and life is ongoing. And, this is me trying to find more freedom. And finding more freedom. It's just slow and non-linear.